So I had to make a scary rabies slide because everybody associates bats with rabies, and for some reason bats are just, everybody thinks that all bats have rabies and that it's really scary and you have to be careful. Well, you do have to be careful. Bats are a rabies vector species, just like any other rabies vector species. But the prevalence of rabies in bats is not higher than other species. In fact, it's lower than some other species, and you're much more likely to get rabies from a dog than you are from a bat. In general, the reason why this myth kind of comes up is when people come in contact with bats, they're usually not doing well. They may not be rabid, but if you find a bat laying on the ground, it's not natural, so you need to really be careful. And it's basically educating people never pick up a bat. If you have a bat in your house, there's a lot of instructions on the internet about how to get it out. Open windows, throw a sheet over it, whatever you have to do. But you don't want to handle this species, but it is a myth that bats have a really high prevalence of rabies. That's not true. Now, bats are problematic. Not everything about them is good, and I've mentioned this. They will get in your house, and nobody really wants to see bats flying around your living room. Even me would probably be like, oh, that's not so good. I don't know where they're coming from. but these are free-tailed bats. You can see their tails even in this kind of blurry, faraway picture. And this is the most common species causing problems in Georgia. These pictures are from coastal Florida, actually, but we have the same issue. These tiles on the roof are where the bats love to cram up underneath and get a lot of heat. So they put on these really fancy houses with tiles, and they just got tons of bats. So everybody freaks out. You probably would freak out if you had this many bats. That's definitely a problem. But you don't necessarily have to call someone and pay thousands of dollars to get the problem taken care of. I always tell people when they call, first settle down and tell me how many bats you have. And a lot of times it's like, I think there's 5. It's like, okay, you'll be fine. Everybody's going to be okay. But if you have hundreds of bats, you might need help. But you need to look at the problem. Mainly, you want to identify how they're getting in, where they're getting in. And you can usually see that if you go out at night and see where they're flying out from. That's the first thing. And you can often see staining where they're coming in and out. And then this is the really simple exclusion. You put window screening with duct tape on the top and sides over where they're coming in. When the bats go out, they crawl out that screening, and then when they're trying to get back in, they'll land on it and can't get back in. Now they'll look for other places to get in, so this might be where you discover that you have multiple entry points. So you have to be patient and do it over time, but it's really something that most homeowners can do on their own. And then once the bats are all out, you check and make sure they're gone, you can seal up the holes where they're getting in. Hopefully not using spray foam. I have gone to pick up bats with spray foam covering them because people put it in there and the bats try to get in while it's not dry, and then it doesn't do anybody any good. Yeah, so that's not the best solution, although a lot of people do it. But the big thing to consider is that you don't want to exclude bats during the maternity season, which we say is between May 1st and August 15th. That's a big window, but it's pretty helpful in this part of the world because they could have young that can't fly. And those young will be trapped in the roost, and the mothers won't be able to get back, and they'll die. And nobody wants that to happen for a lot of reasons. And if people ask you, all bats in Georgia are protected. You cannot intentionally harm bats. And so that's a good thing that bats have going for them. There are a lot of other species that we have that are kind of the unlucky species that have no protection, but bats actually do. So they're Bat Conservation International. I mention them all the time because they're the main conservation group for bats. They have a ton of information on their website about bat exclusions and how to deal with bats in your home, and I always point people there when they have questions. A lot of people also ask me, the good thing is, people say, I have bats in my house and I don't want them in my house, but I want to give them a house. How do I do it? You can put up a bat house, and it can be the most beautiful, perfect bat house in the best location, and you won't get bats, but you can try your best to make the house the right type of house and put it in the right place so you have a better chance of getting bats. There are many types of houses. Most people don't need a bat condo, but if you have a real problem, you might want to put one up if you have thousands and thousands of bats. But most of them are these smaller, multi-chamber. This is a pretty large maternity box that can hold a lot of bats. You would normally start with a 1 or 2 chambered small box and try to put it up in a good situation. The first thing is that it needs to be the right design. I also have sheets over there for an example of how to build a single chamber bat box, so that you can just start out and see if you get bats. Build a small one first. If you get some, build a bigger one. You need to put it in the right area. A lot of people put them on trees with leaves. So the trees leaf out and then the box is shaded and bats won't use it. They want hot. And you think that it's hot in Georgia. You don't want to have a box in the sun, but they do. They want it to be really hot. That's why they're in your attic. And we usually paint them gray in this part of the world. In Florida, they're often painted white, but in the Northeast, they paint them black so they can get as hot as possible. You want them to be near good habitat. You don't have to have great habitat everywhere. Obviously, if you already have bats, there's habitat nearby, but it's good if they're near water and some trees and other things that can help the bats. And we try to get them at least 20 feet off the ground. The best placement is putting them on a pole, kind of out in the open, where they get a lot of sun. This looks shaded, but it's actually very sunny, where this guy has the boxes in his pecan orchard. And they have a lot of choices for boxes, so they can switch around during different parts of the year. But follow the design protocols and put them in the best place, and hopefully you'll get bats. And it's best to put them up in the winter time, give them a little time to season, and then see if you'll get bats. And you can have an empty box for years, and then one day they'll show up. So you never know. Bats in decline. This is one thing I want to talk about. We consider most of our bats in Georgia to be declining. This is probably the only species that's not, the free-tailed bat, because they are expanding their range, but probably every other species is in some amount of decline. Bats like really nice old-growth habitat in a lot of places. They like trees that are dying with bark falling off. They like clean caves. They need clean water and healthy forests. And we've changed our landscape a lot. We've lost a lot of habitat. We've modified it. Bats have houses now instead of trees to deal with. They have water that's silted over that doesn't have the insect nest coming off. And they have caves that have a lot of disturbance and a lot of trash and very big issues that have caused them to abandon them. So in general, they're dying because of all the things that other wildlife are dying, because of loss of habitat and changes that we've made. And then there were some new things that came onto the landscape. This is a wind farm, which if you guys have been to the Midwest or the Northeast, there are a lot of wind farms. And there are some in the plains areas that are just vast, and then there are a lot of across mountaintops. And it really was, we figured that these would be a bigger problem for birds when they first went up. But one really foggy night in West Virginia, hundreds of bats were found dead under one particular wind farm on the night where visibility was poor. And then people started looking a little closer, and they were finding them everywhere. I don't have current numbers for the numbers that they suspect have died, but it's significant, and we imagine that it's impacting tree bats at a similar level to other issues with the cave bats. And there are a lot of studies going on to try to figure out why. It doesn't appear that there are any kind of noises that attract the bats to these turbines, but they do seem to be attracted to the actual blades, and they'll hit the blades and die that way. And they also will die from kind of a change in barometric pressure right near those turbines. And they are mostly impacted when it's low wind nights, when it's good for bats to fly, and it's foggy conditions. Those are also the nights where you're not getting very much energy from these turbines. So if you turn off the turbines in low wind events, then the mortality decreases pretty much to zero, and the bats are able to fly through. On high wind nights, when these are the most productive, you're not going to get bats and birds migrating nearly as much. But that still costs the energy companies a lot of money, so it's a really hard battle to try to figure out what to do. They're also working on new designs, but everything that's implemented has to be on a level you can easily do. And you can put a boombox with death metal music playing on these, and it will keep bats away, but it's not realistic to be able to mount them on all of the turbines and keep up maintenance, because just crawling one of these towers is a significant effort. So there are many things to consider, and there's a lot of work happening. And we thought that was the worst thing until white nose syndrome came along. How many of you guys have heard of white nose syndrome? So at least half, that's good. This was discovered in 2006 when bats were reported flying outside of caves in the wintertime in New York. And some biologists went to check it out, and they found these bats with white fuzzy noses. A lot of work was done, and it was discovered that those bats were dying of starvation. The fungus grows on the muzzles of the bats and on the wing membranes and irritates their skin, so the bats wake up from hibernation. They regularly wake up throughout hibernation. They have a pretty regular pattern of waking up when they're in caves. But if you wake up one or two extra times, it can kill a bat, because they only have so much fat reserves to get them through the winter. And in the Northeast, when they fly out of caves and there's snow, there's no insects for them to eat, and they die. And that's what was happening. White nose syndrome has spread more quickly than we could have ever imagined. This little red circle is where it started in New York, and this is the map that just came out yesterday, because a new record in Missouri was found yesterday. and we've got some new records in Kentucky. You can see here's Georgia, we have one right there in Tennessee and one right there in Alabama. It's surely in Georgia, we just didn't find it last winter, and we're going to be spending the next couple of months looking for it this winter. All of the species listed here are ones affected by white nose syndrome, and we have all of those species except for the cave myotis. And at this point, it's estimated that 5.7 to 6.7 million bats have died from white nose syndrome. That number is going to continue to go up because the largest hybernacula for Indiana bats, the endangered species, is in this part of their range, and white nose syndrome is just now getting there. So the numbers are just going to keep growing up. It causes mass mortality. Bats fly out of the caves trying to find food, and they either just die in the snow, or they'll cling to trees and fall off, or they die in caves in mass numbers, and these caves are empty of bats and filled with skeletons at this point. The fungus is Geomyces destructans, which is a new fungus to science. It was the genus is very common in caves, but destructans was newly discovered. We know that bats spread it from one to the other, and that's the main way that it's spread. But we also know it can be spread on gear. If you have spores on gear and you take it into another cave, you can move it. We don't have any evidence, really hard evidence, that anyone has moved it in the United States, but we do have some pretty big jumps to sites that have a lot of people and not a lot of bats in them, which makes us think it's possible, but we cannot make any, you can't prove that it happened. We do know now that it came from Europe, likely on caving gear to the cave where it was first found, and the species has been identified in Europe. It's the same species, it's the same strain, it didn't mutate over here. We're not sure if it's native to Europe or if it went through European bat populations a long time ago, and now those bats are the ones that are immune. But over 90% of bats die in caves. In a lot of caves it's 98, 99%, and there are a few species that are surviving, and we do have evidence of reproduction, but there's going to be a huge drop in numbers, and we're not sure if all of the species will make it through. The biggest thing that we can do is decontaminate. If you're going into caves, wear clothes that have never been in a cave if you just go in one once. If you're going into multiple caves, you need to decontaminate your gear between caves, because not just this fungus, but there are so many things unique to cave environments that we've probably been spreading around forever, and this could be the first of many things like this that could happen. We have a white nose response plan, lots of information on our website if you want to check it out. I have a brochure over there with some more information, and there's a lot on the web. And the main thing is to educate people about what's happening with white nose syndrome. If you hear a caver talking, make sure you ask them if they're aware of this and they're decontaminating, and just educate people about why bats are important and that we should care.